When I think about my history in the mecha genre, there are certain names and franchises that always seem to crop up, generally leading me to go, yeah, I should probably watch that somewhere. It all started for me with Mobile Suit Gundam, and I'd like to move into some of the other major and obvious works like the Macross franchise somewhere down the line too. But then there are also less high profile works like Mazinger, Tetsujin, Getter, Giant Robo and Votoms, things that have influenced so many shows over the years and have paved the way for what we now refer to as the mecha genre. And thus recently I got stuck into one of these important mecha franchises, one that somehow managed to get a Blu-ray release in my country not all that long ago. And that is actually a pretty rare occurrence in the UK, just so you know. So hello, welcome back, I am BakaShift from OtakuKato.com, and today I present to you a review of the very first entry into the Patlabor franchise, Mobile Police Patlabor Early Days. It is a 7-episode sci-fi mecha police comedy OVA that aired between 1988 and 1989, was produced by Studio Dean, written by Kazunori Ito and directed by none other than Mamoru Oshii. This franchise is one that fits the bill and falls straight into the real robot category in a way that's more apparent than in many other series. It's very much an entirely real-world setting, only instead of just cars and horses, the bobbies run around in robots from time to time as well. So Mobile Police Patlabor is a story set in a not too distant future where at some stage great advances in technology have brought mecha known as labors into existence. These labors are thusly named due to their primary usage being for heavy construction and industry, but soon enough the power of these machines began to be used for less honest purposes. Thus, once these labor crimes became commonplace, a new law enforcement division was ushered in, on with their own, known as patrol labors, or simply Pat labors. I see what you did there. With which they then became able to combat any and all wrongdoers on equal terms. As our tale begins, where you're introduced to a few new recruits joining the Tokyo Metro Police's Special Vehicles Division 2, one of which being our main character, Izumi Noah. From here on out, we follow this band of merry mecha pilots through their lives of various amusing and interesting things, and well, occasionally fighting crimes, as any good police officer should. Seeing as I went into this thing with basically nothing more than the mecha designs to go off of, I was very interested by the simple fact that there is next to no mention of the military in this thing. When I think of just about every other mecha franchise, be it from the 70s or airing this very season, they all seem to use war as a heavy theme. So this brings the scale of what's going down in Patlabor down to its bare face value. So with that, along with what I was saying earlier about how this franchise sums up what Real Robot is all about, the world we're presented feels a lot more relatable and close to home. With one of the main things making this so being the fact that whilst this thing did feature mecha and it was the main idea behind its premise, that is not what it's about. Instead, this thing has more of a classic cop show vibe to it, with a clear split of good guys versus bad guys in its story. But that's only at the points where it is delving into something crime-based, as a lot of the time mechs are completely removed from the story in favour of what can only really be described as a slice-of-life comedy. What about cops that, you know, just so happens to have robots in it? It also had its fair share of cheesy gags and humour, with the crimes themselves often being very simple, or an investigation would be going down into something that wasn't actually a crime at all. So in comparison to some of the blood-pumping and explosive mecha series you all know and love, this thing is going to come across fairly slow to some. Then, with its near-fully episodic storytelling, others who aren't able to get along with that style of narrative could be divided. I personally have always been on the fence about episodic series, and whilst I generally have problems with them due to the variance of story quality, I feel it worked very well here. It started things off with an episode simply setting the scene. There was one about disarming a bomb, another about finding a sea monster, and they were even off on a ghost hunt at one point. It was fairly silly stuff with a distinct lack of darkness or urgency, but that's only for the most part. You see, episodes 5 and 6 step away from the episodic structure to give you a more focused and serious story, which I'd say was very well done and not at all out of place. And the final episode also takes a pretty different approach to the rest of the series, but that is mainly down to the fact that it had an entirely different director. So overall I found this thing to be a very relaxed and enjoyable experience. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, but it was still able to appeal to my mecha loving side with some pretty top shelf action scenes on occasion. It may have even been more enjoyable in some ways to have this sort of consistent variety, as it made the content that is more typical of the genre to be greatly rewarding and welcome when it did show up. This very simple and unexaggerated style of storytelling flows very heavily into the characters we follow throughout the series as well. There's no stupendously over-the-top obnoxious protagonist to barge you through the narrative, and instead our heroine, Izumi Noah, is someone a great deal more realistic. She's a very enthusiastic, bright and bubbly individual who is very passionate about labours to the point where you could call her an otaku. She cares a great deal about the labour she pilots, even to the point of giving it the nickname Alphonse. Yep, that's right, this series does in fact have a robot in it called Alphonse. Fullmetal Alchemist, on the other hand, does not. Izumi did fill her position well, and within the confines of this story, it was great to see a female protagonist completely void of any kind of sexualization. That is to be assumed in a way though, as she was fairly tomboyish and filled an incredibly masculine role, even if she was actually very feminine and emotional throughout the series. Then the only other character in a main role is another who joins Division 2 as the story starts, Shinohara Asuma. This chap follows a similar design to Izumi in that he too is very simple and plain. He's a smart and honest dude who is actually the heir to a huge heavy industry company who produced 90% of the world's labours. Whilst showing some hot-headed moments here and there, he still manages to be a very reliable and responsible individual. I didn't see him to be as strong of a character as Izumi, but he still filled his role well, and I could totally see him achieving great things somewhere down the line in the larger entries in the franchise. Now, whilst I do say these characters being very normal and believable works and is in many ways a good thing, apart from a select few in the cast, I find nearly all of them at this point to be very forgettable, though I'm sure a great deal of this is down to how little time I've spent with everyone so far. 7 episodes to get to know a fairly large group of characters had it so I even had trouble latching onto and getting behind Shinohara and Izumi because they didn't really get an excessive amount of screen time. Whilst I can't really fault any of our heroes' roles in this series and did find many of them very likeable, I can't help but say so few of them actually felt important. Don't take this as me saying any of these characters are bad, as I am still fully looking forward to seeing where they go in the future. It's just that based off of the 3 hours I've spent with them so far, I can't see them staying in my head all that long. And another thing that surely influenced how I feel about them is that their designs are very plain and simple to match their very human depictions. Some did stand out a bit more than the others, and I commend the show for this, but as a whole, for me, it was not the character designs that drew me into the series, but the design of something else. I'm sure you all know what's coming, as I can say for sure that the main labour used by the Tokyo Metro Police, the AV-98 Ingram, is one of the most interesting and iconic designs in the genre. It fits the police theme so well, all the way down to its leg-holstered revolver cannon and black and white colour scheme with sirens, making it essentially look like a transformed police car. So in a way, I guess it just looks like Prowl from Transformers, but with bunny rabbit ears and a pimp visor? Either way, I think these things look bloody cool, and the little you do see of other labels in the show have me eager to get stuck into the rest of the franchise and see what other beautiful tin cans it has in store for me. Now I'm going to address that thing that a good chunk of you have been thinking since I started this review. That being, yes, this thing is about 25 years old and has an art style and animation quality to match that of a year in which Alan hadn't actually been born yet. But I've got to say, this thing's animation is seriously clean and smooth, and honestly really good for its time, especially with the godlike quality of the recent Blu-ray releases. Cell animation offers a distinctly different feeling to the digital sheen and polish we're used to these days, but being a fan of older series, I can't get enough of this classic rustic aesthetic. This is all very much down to how accustomed you are to older series as to whether or not you'll get a kick out of it, but as I've said before, and I'll say it again in every review I do of an older series, it may well seem a bit jarring at first, but once you've sat down and watched it, you get used to it really quickly, I assure you. That classic and rustic description I gave for the animation is going to be the best way to describe the soundtrack to this series as well. The opening is one of those fantastic cheesy 80s tracks that's about the series itself, with lyrics about how much Izumi just adores her robot. It's not something I'd listen to outside of the series, but I did watch it every time, and it did a very good job at making me smile. Then the background music was great fun with its fantastic grooves, perfectly adhering to that classic cop show feeling I mentioned running through the series. Aside from these tracks though, the soundtrack as a whole did feel fairly simple and plain, to the point where I'd say it did the job and I enjoyed what it brought to the series, but it wasn't all that spectacular. The sound effects for the brilliant robotic clanking were top notch and very high quality considering its age, and the voice acting was all I could ever want really. No one's performances really jumped out as being all that amazing to me, but it was a solid voiceover as a whole, and my girl Clancy even dropped a bit of English here and there.
I'm Chief Officer Clancy at New York City Police.
So this isn't going to be up there with some of my favourites of the genre, at least not until I've got a bit deeper into the franchise, of course. But I did thoroughly enjoy it, and I'm definitely glad I watched it, and pretty much off my tits on happiness that it got licensed and released on Blu-ray. Thus today I shall be patrolling on an industrial 69% rating for Mobile Police Patlabor Early Days, and thoroughly enjoy doing so. In the UK, this thing is licensed by MVM Entertainment, in the US by Made in Japan, and in Australia by Madman, so do with that information whatever you like. So, have you seen this show? If so, what did you think of it? And as always, feel free to drop me a recommendation of what you want me to review next. And with that, I may or may not see you next week.